if we had followed those ideas. That'd be useful information. But, like every other good idea, somebody has to run with it. Hi, Mark.
All right. Okay, it looks like most of us have joined. So, Tom, if you'd like to just briefly introduce yourself, I will work on pulling up the slideshow and getting us rolling.
Okay, well, I'm Tom Butts. I can only see you and me. God, you'd think if I had done Zoom before, I'd know how to use it, but I don't. Anyway, yeah, I'm Tom Butts. I'm in Helena. I've been off and on with AERO for since the 1970s. I live in Helena right now. Retired wildlife biologist that started out studying bighorn sheep and ended up studying bats. So from B to B. And and kind of looking forward to presenting our Repowering Montana. I think I'll wait until we get our slideshow up before I go too much into what it's all about. There it is. All right. So in about 2002, a number of us got together. There were 9 of us, including Max, that put together this report, Repowering Montana, a blueprint for Home-grown Energy Self-Reliance. We spent, gosh, probably about 5 years pulling this thing together. And then there were 3 editions. I believe the first one was in 2007, and then the last one in 2008. And I don't know how many copies we ended up making, but let's go to the next slide. Okay, there it is. Why did we do this? Go to the next slide. This is about as slow as I am. I had been reading some scientists back in the early 2000s that were saying that if we were to avoid catastrophic consequences, the US would need to reduce CO2 emissions by 80% by 2025. And here we are. So next slide. I went into the AERO office. I think Jonda was there. We used to have a permanent staff right here in Helena. And I said, I wonder if we could do this. What would it look like in Montana if we actually could reduce CO2 emissions by 80% by 2025? Could we do that? Next slide. We, in fact, concluded in this report that Montanans could eventually supply all of our internal energy requirements without using fossil fuels. That's a pretty big statement, but we decided we probably could do that. And so we outline in this Repowering Montana how we would do that. So how do we do it? Let's start with this. First of all, we looked at demand side management versus supply side management. Back in the early 2000s, Governor Schweitzer was a Democrat running around with a lump of coal in one hand, and I don't remember what he had in the other hand. Probably a wind.
Oh, he had a jar of
he was into syn fuels. He thought we could produce.
Well, he also had that oil, that plant that was going to be for biodiesel.
Camelina?
Camelina. The Camelina boom.
Oh, yeah.
Never happened, I don't think.
So anyway, supply side was where we were headed in those days. And that essentially meant we would produce as much energy as we could from everything we possibly could. So that included hydrogen, it included coal, it included you name it. And that was the supply side. Demand side management is what we looked at, and we suggested, and we come up with studies in our report here, and there's all kinds of evidence to suggest that the quickest and easiest way is to reduce your use. In other words, through conservation and efficiency. Next slide. So these conservation and efficiency become the foundation for our statement that we can produce all of our homegrown energy needs in Montana. Next slide. So our goal was by 2020 to reduce electricity use by 30%, transportation fuel by 20%, heating fuel use by 27%, while adding thousands of jobs and millions of dollars to the state's economy through conservation and efficiency program policies. Next slide. That's pretty ambitious, but that's what we did. And one of the beginnings of that is to get local. And I think AERO's been looking at that all its lifespan, basically. That the key to all of this is localizing as much as we possibly can food production, food processing and transport, and consumption, production of building materials and all. You can read this, but essentially decentralizing as much as we can and making it local. So next slide. And we looked at the 5 sectors of energy use in Montana: residential, commercial, industrial, transportation, and agriculture. These all use energy, and some of them a lot more than others. So they all really need to be addressed. Next slide. So the first thing we'll look at is homegrown fuels. Next slide. Basically, we have 2 kinds: liquid fuels, which are generally petroleum and natural gas and used primarily for heating and transportation fuels. Next slide. And then there's solid fuels like coal and wood used for heating and generating electricity. Next slide. So in 2003, Montana produced 19 million barrels of crude oil, mostly refined out of state. Now we do have refineries here, but we send most of ours out of state. Of oil refined in Montana, 55% is shipped out of state. Believe it or not, a great deal of the fuel or oil is processed and refined in Montana actually comes from Canada, and we'll see how tariffs deal with that one. Next slide, please. So at that time in the early 2000s, $1.5 billion left Montana every year to pay for petroleum-based fuels. Next slide. So we looked at how we could produce fuels locally through biofuels, ethanol, and biodiesel without adversely affecting soil fertility or cropping practices, while strengthening Montana's rural economy. Now, I think back in the early 2000s, there was quite a bit of spin on how producing ethanol in particular was not a good idea. In fact, that it cost as much or more to produce it in fuels as it produced. And at that time, and I think to this day, there are big subsidies mostly to our agribusiness to produce ethanol for the ethanol that you use mixed with your gasoline and all.
Well, can I just say something briefly, Tom, that I know Cliff Bradley wrote that chapter, and we got into there was a guy from Cornell or somewhere that wrote a pretty important pushback on the ethanol thing, saying it was a big boondoggle and I think we all kind of pushed back on it, but I think in the end, he might have been proven right in that ethanol today in the Midwest has become they're dependent on those plants. And they don't want to give them up. But there was wasn't a lot of acceptance of corn-based gasoline. And I don't know where that debate is today, but
well, today what we did in our report is basically suggest that there are other kinds of ways to produce ethanol. One of them is through cellulose, and so we really focused on how we could produce a heck of a lot of ethanol just from straw, for instance, from crops without affecting food production whatsoever.
yeah.
So that was one of the things, and we went into quite detail about how ethanol could be a potential, and biodiesel. And I'll get back to that near the end of this production, but things have changed a little bit since then. Okay, next for now. So our goal by 2020 through energy efficiency and conservation practices was to lower per capita demand to supply up to 50% of Montana's fuel needs with ethanol and biodiesel produced in-state in decentralized facilities. I noticed that our report in the beginning and throughout has said we can produce all of our power needs, and here we have a goal of 50%, but that was by 2020. And I think over time, we would suggest through increasing efficiency, increasing conservation, and more bringing things online in Montana, we could actually produce 100% of our fuel needs. Okay, next. And then we looked at electricity. Okay, next. In 2005, 65% of Montana's electricity was provided by burning coal, most of the rest from hydropower, and that's big hydropower, big dams. Next. So our goal was by 2020 to have implemented conservation measures and have reduced Montana's electric sale by 30%, meeting all the electric in-state electric needs through diversified, clean and renewable sources, including hydropower, wind, solar, geothermal, some biofuels, and advanced methods of storing and distributing energy. Okay, next. So I didn't really go into it, but the report, we also went quite a bit into some of the biggest problems with developing our plan is financing. So we would have, and we still would have to have some pretty creative financing. One thing, leveling the playing field by quitting to give subsidies to fossil fuels might be a help, but there's a lot of other things. For instance, I don't know what it costs to put in a facility like Judith Gap, for instance, or the two large wind producers up between Shelby and Cut Bank. I think each of those up there have over 120, something like that, 120 turbines, and each turbine is millions of dollars. So it's huge investment. And one of the things which we looked at even way back then is, wouldn't it be beautiful if every town along the High Line had 2 or 3 or 4 of those big towers, and they could produce all of their electricity for their town and have an income? But they don't have the millions and millions of dollars to put that up in the first place. So how do you come up with that? We also addressed things like construction, commercial, residential, you name it, industrial, all of this construction, from concrete to wood, everything else, it takes a lot of energy. So We did address some of that, and I didn't go into any kind of detail here at all. So anyway, the bottom line is, how did we do? And you probably have a good idea how we did. Here it is, 2025. Next slide. Here's energy. Montana fuel use. Go ahead and look at about 2002, and then, well, it's gone up. The top line is a combination of highway, non-highway, diesel, et cetera. But fuel use continues its climb. Next slide. Here's natural gas consumption. It was way high back in the 60s or 70s, went quite a ways down till about 1985, 88. And then it's been on a climb up ever since.
Yeah, but
At the very end, it drops just to here, but it's still, the trend is up.
Yeah, but
Next
if you look at
slide.
2002, it's up, but yeah, population's up too. So that's through 2021. That's interesting. Is that the latest you could find, Tom?
Yep, that's it. That's what I
Wow.
have. That's produced actually by DEQ this last year.
You'd be a little more up
Next.
to date than that. Gosh.
Next, please. Electricity, here we go again from 60 to 2021. Basically up, a few hiccups here and there.
What are
But-
those? What's the top one? That's total.
Yes. Next.
Tom, I'm just saying I can't. I mean, I'm having trouble reading the line. Is it the bottom
Well,
three
I
lines are
don't think-
fairly stable? So
I didn't, and I mean, what you really need is just to see the trend is up. That's kind of the point here.
all right.
Next. And here we have the famous carbon dioxide up and up and up and up. So how did we do? Next slide. So let's look a little more at detail. Wind power is one thing that has really taken off. Let's look at the next slide. Here's total nameplate capacity and percent of total capacity. As you can see, both of them are going up, but even, I guess this was 2022, we were still at 18% capacity. And I don't know the details of how that's decided or whatever, but the bottom line is that wind generation is going up and up and up in Montana. Next slide. This is as of last year, wind power facilities larger than 9 megawatts. I believe total supply here is about 1,100 megawatts annually. What I can't find is where all this goes.
Yeah, that was gonna be my question. Tom, I'm curious, do you know if we're actually using this or if it's all going to?
I have a pretty darn good idea. I worked on Judith Gap at the very beginning. I also have worked on actually a number of these. But go ahead and look up near the very top, Glacier Wind number 1 and 2 and Rimrock Wind. Both of those are Nature Enter as the owner. When I went up to Glacier Wind, they had about half the towers up. I was asked to come up and do bat surveys up there for all of these projects. And there were probably a dozen trailers out in the middle of a wheat field. And I went out to look for the site manager, and I walked into one of these, and it was all young men speaking Spanish and looking at their computers, and they couldn't speak English. So they did point out where the site manager was, and I went over there. He was from Oregon. And so we visited a minute, and I said, "Where are all the Montanans?" And he said, "You're looking at her. It was the secretary was the Montana." So I asked her, where are all your neighbors? And she said, well, when they very first started construction, they had to clear pads for all the towers and all that. And there were people in the vicinity, Cutbank and Shelby and whatnot, that could operate heavy equipment. But once it comes into bringing in these huge turbines and standing them up and hooking them all up with the electricity that and everything, all the computer stuff, nobody in the state of Montana could do that. These guys were all from Spain that were putting all this together. And the company actually was owned by, it's a Spanish company. And where's the electricity? Well, that electricity was contracted to go to San Diego.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that most of this is leaving the state, but I don't have figures for that.
Would you say like 70%, 80%, 50?
I don't have any idea.
Okay.
I really don't. I think you could say, see the very biggest ones, look at 240, 210, 189, 135. Those are the majority of everything. Then it drops down relatively dramatically. Actually, Stillwater Wind and South Peak are both in the 80s, but I would bet those big ones are contracted out of state, but I do not have, I can't say for sure.
Okay.
All right. And then let's look at solar a little bit next. I mean, here's 2017 as initial operations. I mean, we're talking 17 megawatts. It's pretty puny. And I have some issues with utility scale solar myself. Anyway, so next.
It's all that same company. It's all one company.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, we got, I don't think it's local. I don't think any of that stuff. I'm not sure it's local.
And can you back that up again? I'm sorry, what was that slide?
This is utility scale solar PV facilities.
Wow, that is surprising that that's all there is.
It is, yeah. You know, and there's been, I mean, I think the BLM recently was looking at studies of putting a lot of these commercial utility scale on BLM, but there's a lot of pushback on that too, you know. And when you're in Montana and you say, well, look, we're producing electricity in Montana and disturbing wildlife habitat and blah, 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 you know, to send electricity to Las Vegas. Is that what we want to do, you know? To run fountains in the desert? I don't know. Anyway, I'm being...
So do you know, Mark is asking the question, what are the issues with utility scale solar?
Mostly the land that they disturb. I don't know, just a few months ago, I went down through south of Las Vegas, and my God, I think just south of Las Vegas, there's, I think we went 12 miles of passing these utility scale things. I mean, a constant 12 miles, probably 2 miles, 3 miles wide and 12 miles long of these. And essentially, when you put those up, there's not much underneath them. They shade out everything. So it's a huge disturbance to wildlife habitat, let's put it that way.
And something that's on this scale of 2 to 3 megawatts, like, is that over?
I don't know. I don't know how big those are, how many acres that would be. I really don't know at all. And I think Mark Deck, I'm getting questions kind of pop up, but I can't see the whole thing. But I think Mark asked something about potentials with agriculture. And I think if these were designed to the same as wind turbines, you know, you can, I think with designing it right, you might minimize the impacts to, let's say, native rangelands and whatnot. But
There are people that are, I think Mark's alluding to it, that are having luck growing crops beneath panels.
yeah,
They've started to develop seeds seed packages, that's not the right word, but whatever, that manage the types of vegetation that grows, that's, you know, fairly native, perennial, and is of a limited height. And then if you can modify the orientation of the panels, you can also get animals in there. So people are starting to think differently.
Yeah, yeah.
Before we leave this, I have a thought that's probably a longer conversation. So are you done with this?
Before we leave the slide, or before we leave this
Before we leave
presentation?
utility scale solar? Question.
Well, can we wait till the end, please?
Okay.
Next slide, because I'd like to wind this up fairly quick. So here's market penetration. Basically, that just shows you, and I think this was from last year from something DEQ published, but you can just quickly go across the top states, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Hawaii, et cetera, and you can see that California has.
Geez, look at North Carolina. Wow.
Yeah.
Mm.
Just take a bit to look at that, but we've got a long ways to go, I guess, as far as solar market wise up there.
Like you say, a lot of this is import, is export.
Yeah, I think so.
And this talks about
Yep.
penetration to our market. It's not clear if it's our market or just the market in general.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Interesting.
So, you know, we had a reliance on, when we wrote this report, we thought, boy, biofuels are really going to take off. And that was now almost 25 years ago, 20 years ago when we published this. And at that time, there were some small commercial ethanol plants. Well, we have today none in Montana that I'm aware of. It's kind of amazing, but can you go to the next slide? Yeah, exactly. We haven't really done it, but go ahead to the next one. The facility, what am I trying to think of? Up in Great Falls, Montana Renewables is or was ramping up to produce 12,000 barrels per day of renewable diesel, with future plans to produce 25,000 barrels a day. And this would be using Montana-sourced oilseed crops. Now, this renewable diesel, I don't know that much about it, but it's a process where they're making a diesel fuel out of seed oil that, unlike biodiesel, like the biodiesel that we know is really not exactly the same as diesel. It can't be mixed with it, to my knowledge, and you have to do certain things to your machinery to be able to run it. Well, this renewable diesel, you can run right in with the diesel energy, with the engines that you have right now, which is kind of amazing. So this, just recently I saw that they had, I don't remember the figure, but it's pretty big, like maybe $40 million or something like that, that they were going to get a federal grant to proceed with this. And our governor and a couple in our senators were saying, oh boy, this is going to help Montana. And then all of a sudden, the loan disappeared and the company is going, huh? And our governor and our senators are saying, well, we need to say, we're trying to save money here. So I don't know what's going to happen to them, but we don't know what's going to happen to a lot of things, I guess. So let's see. Mark said that Kristen or somebody knows quite a bit about Calumet. Is that somebody here online? I don't hear anything. Anyway, next. So I just want to throw these out just to hear, and then we can get into discussions and open it up. But, were we off base in doing this? Were we just crazy? And was it worth it? I think it was really worth it. I think to this day, I mean, we could tweak things differently. Some things have really changed, but the attempt to show here that we could produce, I don't know if we can do 100%. We said we could. I still think maybe we could, but I think it was important to throw it out there, even though it doesn't look like we made much of a dent. So what would we do differently? One of the things in our report that we talked about some is that AERO members could take this to their own communities and, begin working to get more people behind such a vision, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't really come up with a way specifically to do that, though. And I think one of the things that I've realized, and I think others have, is that we put most of our energy, our human energy, into making this report. And then we kind of just threw it out there. I mean, there was, I think Ben Brower took it to the legislature. I met with the lieutenant governor and presented to him, and he asked some questions about it. But in a way, we just threw it out there, and it didn't get much traction. And I think now that I realize a project like this probably needs about 10 or 20% into producing it and 80 to 90% into selling it. And we didn't plan for that at all. So next slide. And I'll just let you read that. I think this day and age, it's kind of a tough sell for a lot of people to get seriously into conservation and efficiency beyond buying a light bulb or something. I mean, and we certainly don't have any support with the current administration. Anyway, that's it for me.
I just want to make a note that our AI note taker says we reached our recording limit.
Yes, I don't know who that is. Somebody, it's somebody who registered and who's not here.
He's note taker. Oh, I see. That's
Or maybe it is. Maybe it is somebody who's here. Maybe Nikki Hall. Thank you so much, Tom. Really, really helpful. I have a question, but I want to go back to, there was one that Mark had at the very beginning. And it related to the discussion we were having on biodiesel back at the start of the presentation. And I'm just reading Mark's question. He says that Jesse Theron with Yellowstone Teton Clean Cities Coalition is a big proponent of renewable biodiesel, and I really respect his knowledge. However, I'm concerned about the conversion of food croplands to oilseed crops. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think that needs to be considered, definitely. I tried to call Bob Quinn the other day, but he didn't respond in time. I know way back, actually about 20 years ago, Bob was talking about hoping that he could produce all of his own fuels on his own property for all of his farming operations on less than or 10% of his acreage. And I think he has done that. In fact, I think he's done better than that. So it's, we certainly don't want to turn all of our food production into fuel production. And I think that's where conservation and efficiency come in a lot of ways too. There has to be some balance here, obviously.
Yeah.
One thing that happened with the camelina is that it was selling at $8 a whatever as a food oil, which was way better than selling it for 250 as a fuel oil.
Mhm.
That if you're going to grow it, you made more money as a food oil. So, and I don't know in the end how many people found growing camelina here was a good idea, just worked well or not.
Yeah, and it got diverted into aviation fuel, which is not really a primary, interest for Montanans per se, but I'm sure it's attractive
Huh.
a carbon credit perspective for industries outside Montana, so I think that's why it's gone that way. I think the other thing that has gotten in the way with biofuels, and don't think I'm saying anything you guys don't already know, but I had the opportunity to drive across North Dakota and South Dakota and eastern Montana this last summer and was literally speechless by the sheer mileage of the corn cropland, and there were soybeans in there too, and I'm sure that's also used, but the amount, how quickly, if somehow it gets into the capitalist mentality that this is the way to go, then we pursue it at such a high level. It takes on a life of its own that actually ends up not being in service to the original intention. And now we have so much acreage in conventional corn. It is hard to fathom how that will ever stop, even though there's a lot of evidence recommending to stop the use of ethanol in cars. I mean, the whole thing is you pay extra now not to have ethanol in your gas. And yet it's such a juggernaut behind it. It's hard to fathom how we can turn that boat around and actually use cropland responsibly towards biofuel production.
Well, another issue I wanted to raise, like with the solar farms, and I was just thinking about this the other day before this talk. One of the things we didn't really take into serious consideration was that, so when all of a sudden we started getting, when they figured out how to do these big solar farms, again, it's another export crop and, export commodity, and it goes to Las Vegas or it goes to somewhere. And we were all one of the things we noted in the report was that Montana, even then, and probably still is, 50% of the energy produced in Montana went out of state already. We only needed 50% of what we produced here for our needs, and we sold the rest. It wasn't being produced to be sold here. And so what is, in my mind, if we could really, the magic wand waving exercise, and there's a couple approaches. Mark mentioned in Australia, a third of the electricity is local distributed. If the business model were such that we could put solar on top of big box stores and all that, local distributed energy, we probably could do a lot of our urban electricity easy here. And if you're going to be selling electricity from coal-fired power plants before they all go away, or if we're going to use the grid to ship energy out of here, then you can bypass the local use and get more bucks because Seattle wants more money. They'll pay more money for those clean electrons. But I think it's sort of a tragedy that down in the Arizona and places like that, we're building these huge in Nevada, these huge solar farms instead of going the distributed route. But that's because capitalism knows how to eventually fund and sell big commodified solar farms, and it's just so much more complicated to do the distributed route. So there's a whole mindset shift that I don't know if we thought about it enough, and I still don't think we're thinking about it enough. I mean, I haven't really studied the Green New Deal in depth, but one criticism I've heard, and of course the Biden administration was like all of the above, we're going to do everything. And they have expanded electricity, but it's still based on the idea that we're just taking for granted that the growth curve keeps going up. Demand curve is going to go up. We're not going to challenge the demand side. We're just going to create more supply, but it's going to be renewable. And there's so much evidence that we don't have to, in fact, we can't really afford as a planet to assume exponential growth, but we really haven't found a way to attack that mindset or address that mindset in a way that really is compelling and shows that we won't go bankrupt by doing it. And without doing that, we're going to get all these new technologies, but then there's just to create, I mean, like the
Yeah.
server farm thing, right? The whole server farm deal.
Yeah.
You build all these big solar farms in Nevada so that you can store your pictures forever. And so corporations can, send all their corporate report, all their meetings around and everything else. And that seems to be where where the alternative, I don't know what the constituency is for, a more carbon neutral planet. We haven't got our hands around the growth piece. It's like we made a compromise and said, okay, we'll go big time on renewables, but we're not going to challenge the exponential growth model. And
Yeah. We haven't moved it. I think, is it fair to say we have not moved the needle on conservation or reduce your use? Really?
so Mark, of course, he's way ahead of us, and he's telling us that there is legislation to address this. Thank you, Mark.
SB 188 in the Montana legislature right now would allow community solar, which could impact solar penetration. It has passed the Senate and will be heard in the House after transmittal. Support would be appreciated. Also, data AI centers look to be a big thing coming in Montana as well, and Northwest Energy is all in on providing coal power for those. Yay.
Oh, God.
No, and that's to me has been one of the big disappointments that we were actually making strides on energy effectiveness, energy efficiency in building and stuff. And then these things came along and just blew all that out of the water. That and indoor marijuana farms. Apparently in Denver, they were getting close to net zero on electricity in the indoor industrial marijuana farms. That was the first thing that blew their electric budget out of the water.
Robin, are you there?
Yeah.
Are only a few of us unmuted? I was wondering at this stage if other people, because I can't see people's comments, but I'm only hearing two of us.
Tom,
I'm
Tom,
reading Mark's comments because Mark is in a crowded, noisy coffee shop.
Oh.
Asked
you
if
open up
somebody.
you can open up the chat. You can open up the chat and see the chat. But I think on your iPad, Tom, you might have a couple panels you could switch, and you'll all see other people on the
I don't
call.
see anything.
Everybody,
You can't swipe over and get more.
well, I'm not sure how to help you here.
Oh,
Katie,
that's
in the top right corner, there might be, it should say a little thing that says view and have like something that looks like a grid. And if you
Oh,
click
there
on, if you click on the one that says gallery, there you can see everyone. Of course, most
Oh.
of it's off screen, so you're going to just see a lot of boxes.
I agree. A lot of people are muted. Maybe they could speak up. I agree with you, Tom. That's a good invitation. I'll mute myself.
I
There's
have a
Mark.
question. Oh. I have a very quick question for you guys who were, deep in this back in the early 2000s. I was, in the bleachers, just a consumer at that point. And I remember kind of to the day when diesel prices surpassed gas prices. Prior to that, diesel was the cheap fuel. And I was just curious from the work you were doing at the time, there were lots of sort of stories, but it just seemed to me odd that it really kind of happened overnight. And I'm just curious if you have any insights from the work that you did about, what the rationale was to make the transportation fuel so expensive. This is what carries product across the country.
I don't know. I don't remember anything specific. You know, they just said it was all of a sudden it was more expensive, but I was never sure why. So there's a lot of questions.
You know, the inability to really move the distributed energy conversation. I think places like San Diego have done a good job. Mark probably knows, but that just hasn't caught on. Like it makes sense, but the companies don't make money on it. So, which is really unfortunate. Maybe I'm being too simplistic, Mark.
Are you guys familiar with the Snowy River project?
I'm
Down
not.
in County? Because this is where it seems to me big energy is going today. It feels very similar to again, I wasn't around at the time, but my understanding, the way big energy came in during the energy crisis of the 70s and sort of, this is Robin's talking, but this perspective of coming in sort of as a savior and saying, we will make sure there's cheap energy. We'll just make all these coal plants provide cheap energy. And now the topic is we're coming in to save the day with climate change. And the Snowy River project is a project to build a pipeline from northern Wyoming, take it about 250 or 300 miles to Carbon County, over the border into Montana. Basically, they're taking pressurized carbon dioxide from their natural gas plants in Wyoming, and the goal is to pipe them to an area of federal and state land in Carbon County and dig holes that are, I don't know, they're over a mile deep, to pump natural. It's like 15, I think it's like 15 holes in the land to push this carbon dioxide, because it pencils from a carbon sequestration perspective. And this is sort of like a pioneering frontier universe, and this is the first one that's being planned in the state. Northern Plains is really working hard to try to stop it, as they have always done before. But that's the new direction. Like, no one's really we're not stopping on the fossil fuel. We're just making the carbon credits.
We're going to hide it. Yeah. It's discouraging, I think. And some of the TV ads, you know, before the election, in fact, were even poo-pooing conservation and Biden. I mean, to big time, to say Biden's going to take and Kamala's going to take your car away from you. You know, you won't have a car anymore if these guys get a hold of you. I think several years ago I was at a meeting, and I mean, it wasn't that long ago, but 5 and 10 years goes by in a hurry. And I was out in California, and I was looking at some figures, and it was pretty remarkable. I mean, there were graphs showing how conservation and efficiency over time in California is dramatic. I mean, they've made huge inroads into conservation and efficiency at one level. However, because of population growth and other reasons, consumption was still rocketing up, even though we were being a lot more efficient about it. You know, so yeah.
I think at the time California was pretty level on consumption per capita using that metric.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Mark said, this seems scary to me. CO2 has been used a long time for enhanced oil recovery because CO2 is miscible with oil. There's concern that the sequestration is actually an enhanced oil recovery project. Okay, that's even. Okay.
You need to hear other folks that are listening what they think, how they're what's their sense of all this? Is it still worth thinking about these things? Everybody's quiet.
I know.
I'll come on and say hi. Good to meet you all. My name is Shannon. I live in Missoula. So I work for the National Renewable Energy Lab, and I'm working on a couple of different projects related to stuff going on here in Montana. One of those being trying to learn more about what's going on with Montana renewables. So I guess to the question of is it still worth doing all of this? Obviously, I've built my career around how important I think it is to do all of this. But specifically in Montana, I guess a question to all of you all who've been in this game for a lot longer than I have, specifically related to renewable diesel, I guess. So Montana Renewable seems like it provides an opportunity for Montana to really lead in that space, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, I know, especially with biodiesel, just like with distributed wind has been in the past, there have been lots of kind of booms or promises or ideas that something's going to take off and then maybe it flops and then you have all these people left holding the bag where they've put all this land into corn or they've put a lot of investment into distributed wind or something or other, and then it never really pays off for them. So I would just love to hear y'all's thoughts about that issue and if you have any concerns that that would happen related to Montana renewables or if you see it as an opportunity.
You know, I mean, from what I've seen, and it isn't very much, it seems like it's a potential. But God, I don't know. For one thing, it'd be nice if these were replacing rather than adding to. And that, so often what we've seen is we get a new source of something and all of a sudden we're just adding to what we already have. I think that was kind of a shock to me when I first got involved in large wind power in this state, because initially I was like, oh boy, we're going to do this and we're going to bring on a lot of wind and it's going to replace coal. But the only thing it just seems to add to it, and I can see the same thing with biodiesel, or their biodiesel, I guess. Renewable diesel it's just adding more to the mix.
Yeah. And Mark says, I think that sustainable aviation fuel demand is a function of airlines' desire for social license. I am worried that in the current political environment, that desire may decline. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great point, Mark. I'm thinking too about, I work with folks kind of all over the country who are working on different clean energy projects. Two that come to mind right now are I'm working with somebody in Indiana and then somebody else in Kentucky. And both of these groups in these different places are essentially going through the same thing where they have large industrial private companies that operate where they live. And these companies have an overseas parent company in Europe or in Asia. And the parent companies actually have their own renewable energy requirements that they're now asking those industrial producers to meet. So even if part of it is social license, like if you don't have that driver of a parent company asking you to do that, I feel like that could be another piece of the puzzle here. I'm not completely sure where ownership lies for Montana renewables or who would seek to benefit from that. But it's just another question, I guess, that your response made me think about too.
Although didn't the current president encourage people to buy Teslas?
Yes, just yesterday, I think. So.
Well, on that topic, a bunch of one group I hear from, a bunch of people are all selling their Teslas, and there's about 4 other electric cars that everybody's very happy with that aren't Teslas that are out there. I forget their names, but there's like 4 other very good electric cars out there you can buy.
Yeah.
I don't know where the charging stations are, but I still think the biggest problem facing a more resilient planet is the extractive mindset that we have in our economic thinking, whether it's food or energy
Yeah.
or entertainment or whatever. And that's a hard one to address.
Went back when we were working on this and Schweitzer was governor. He's a Democrat with the Republican well, lieutenant governor. That was interesting. But one of the things besides his, sin fuels and coal, he kept saying that he didn't want us, he wasn't suggesting that we're going to go back living like monkeys eating nuts or something like that. And I think to this day, there's a widespread belief among the average consumer that when we talk much seriously about these figures that we were talking about here, cutting back our use by 30%, people automatically seem to assume, oh my God, I'll be eating nuts and living under the shade tree. I can't have my current consumptive lifestyle, as though that's a negative. And it's been a hard sell to say, well, maybe it might be a positive for all of us. I don't know how we approach that. We've talked about it now for 80 years or more.
Well, like everything, there's a lot of people that are talking, there's all kinds of degrowth websites and
Sure.
there are. And so that there's a lot of parallel conversations, but a lot of them don't get into the mainstream and they don't get serious contemplation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just a lot of thinking that isn't very imaginative. I don't know what the solution to that is, but I'm disappointed sometimes in how simplistic people can be, these reporters. And just that kind of response you mentioned, Tom, it's the same with better food nutrition. People say that we have a chronic health disease issue in this country and we're going to address it. And I heard this, seasoned reporters say, oh, we're going to be made to, eat broccoli they're just this kind of simplistic response to, it's like they're going to take away your hamburger. And that's very disturbing too, but I don't know why we bring that up, but I think I'm suggesting that there's a cultural, I think 33 by 33 requires a cultural shift.
Yep. Yeah.
So in a way, the things that we didn't do in 2006 or whenever, 7, which is, as I suggested, only putting too much into the production and not enough into the how do you implement it. And I think for this Abundant Montana, and I think it is being addressed, that it's a lot more than just saying we're going to do it. What are the steps? What exactly do we do to bring this into fruition? And I think right now we're just talking to the choir around and around and around right here about the same issues that we've had for a long time.
Well, my takeaway is just what you said, and I appreciate you taking the time to put it all together, which is the answer is fairly straightforward from a production standpoint, but the baton that you're passing to the next group is focus on implementation and focus on shifting a consumptive mindset. Not that which is not the easy part, but
Yeah.
But that's clear. That's really, really clear, and I appreciate the clarity and the simplicity of the opportunity. So, yeah. Well, I see we're at time. I don't know if Caitlin's going to jump back on or not, but I did want to. Oh, there she is. Okay,
Yes, we're at time, but this session was recorded. So if anybody is interested, this will be on our YouTube channel in the coming days. And any follow-up questions, you can feel free to reach out to me and I'd be happy to point you in the right direction.
Great.
And Tom, thank you again for your time.
Yeah,
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for going
thanks.
back and bringing those numbers forward.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Have a great afternoon.
okay, bye-bye.